I need you to walk through this with me because I can't figure out why this is even being said out loud. Let's just sit with it for a second because this isn't one of those stories where something actually happened and now we're reacting to it. This is something different. This is a story about an idea that hasn't happened, an idea that on paper doesn't even make sense. And yet here we are talking about it like it's a real possibility. There's no actual evidence of a deal, but in a case built on secrets and powerful connections and a dead co-conspirator, the question isn't just what is happening, it's why so many people assume something is. Because right now, some members of Congress are having conversations about pardoning Ghislaine Maxwell. Not quiet conversations, not buried in some fringe corner of the internet, out loud, on the record. And that should feel strange, shouldn't it? It should feel like one of those moments where you stop and say, how did we get here? How did we get from one of the most notorious criminal cases in modern American history to a place where the idea of wiping that slate clean is something people are willing to say out loud? Because here's the thing. This episode isn't really about whether a pardon is going to happen. It's about why the possibility of one doesn't sound absolutely crazy to some people anymore. And that might be the most telling part of all. A good Monday to everyone, and welcome to Your Neighbor on the Left, the podcast where we talk about progressive politics, human decency, and life on the blue side of America's ideological divide. My name is Don Spielis, and I am your host. And today we're going to be talking about something that, for the life of me, I don't understand. I can't begin to grasp it. The possibility of a parole for Ghislaine Maxwell. There is a lot to unpack here. So before we get into any of the speculation or the politics or the timing, the raised eyebrows and the questions that will undoubtedly be uncomfortable, we need to start somewhere solid. I need to start with what actually happened. Just on the rare chance that there's anyone out there who really doesn't know. In a story like this, where so much of it feels unresolved, it's really easy to lose the part that isn't up for debate. This part isn't controversial. This part is what a jury already decided. Ghislaine Maxwell wasn't convicted because she was nearby. She wasn't convicted because of some sort of tangential association or rumor of guilt by proximity. She was convicted because a federal jury looked at the evidence and decided that she played an active role in helping Jeffrey Epstein recruit, groom, and exploit underage girls. Not a passive participant, not as someone who just looked the other way while it was happening. As someone who helped to make it happen. And to my mind, that distinction matters. Because there's a version of this story that people sometimes try to tell, where she's just this socialite who got caught up in Epstein's orbit. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong friends. That's not what the facts say. That's not what the conviction says. The conviction says she was part of the mechanism. And think about what that means for a second. This wasn't just a series of crimes committed by one man. According to the jury, this was something that required coordination, trust, repetition, a system, if if you will. And Maxwell was a cog in that system. In December of 2021, she was found guilty on multiple counts tied to the sexual exploitation of minors. Charges that included conspiracy and sex trafficking related offenses. The kind of charges that don't come from a single bad decision, but a pattern, an established pattern of behavior over time. Then in June of 2022, she was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. 20 years. Not symbolic, not a slap on the wrist, not one of those sentences where you hear it and you go, well, that's not really accountability. 20 years is real time. It's the justice system saying this was serious, this was proven, and this deserves a significant consequence. And for a moment, it looked like the story had reached its conclusion, at least for Ms. Maxwell. Epstein was gone. She was convicted. The system had done what it was supposed to do, except it hasn't ever really felt closed, has it? Even at the time, there was this lingering sense that something was missing, that the story, as massive and disturbing as it was, had somehow been reduced to just two names. One dead and one in prison. And that was it. No broader reckoning, no sweeping accountability for anyone else who might have been involved, connected, aware, or complicit. Just silence. And that silence matters because when a case touches as many powerful circles as this one did, when it brushes up against wealth and politics and influence and global connections, people don't expect it to just end quietly. They expect more. They expect layers. They expect names. And when those things don't come, or I guess more accurately, when they come but nothing comes of it, people start to wonder why. Now, that doesn't change the conviction. It doesn't change what the jury decided. It doesn't undo the fact that Maxwell is serving a 20-year sentence for very real crimes. But it does create something else. A gap. And that gap is where everything else we're about to talk about begins. Now, let's sit in that gap for a minute, because this is where the story stops being about what happened and starts becoming about what didn't. You had one of the most explosive criminal cases in modern memory, at least in mine for sure. A network that by its nature required access and trust, required a pipeline of victims and a system to sustain it. And yet, the ending that we got feels small. Jeffrey Epstein is dead, officially ruled a suicide while in federal custody, a moment that all by itself shattered public confidence in the system, whether you believe every conspiracy theory that's spun out of that or not. The simple fact is this: the central figure in the case died before a trial could happen, before evidence could be laid out in public, before names could be forced into the open, before the full scope of what he built could be examined under oath. And that matters, because trials don't just determine guilt. They tell stories. They expose systems. They create a record that people can point to and say, this is what happened and this was who was involved. And we never got that. Instead, we got fragments, documents released in pieces, names mentioned, but often without context, associations that were suggestive but not adjudicated. Enough to raise questions, enough to get people talking, but not enough to answer the questions. And into that vacuum stepped Ghislaine Maxwell. Her trial was, in many ways, the only real window the public got into how this operation functioned. But even that window felt too narrow. The charges focused on specific victims, specific timeframes, specific conduct. That's how criminal law works. It narrows, it focuses, it proves what it can prove. But the public was looking for something broader. I know I was. They were looking for the full map or something close to it. Who knew what? Who was involved? Who benefited? Who looked the other way? And instead, what they got was a case that, while serious and consequential, didn't answer those larger questions. So you end up in this strange place where two things are true at the same time. Maxwell was convicted, justice in that sense was served, and yet it still feels like something is missing. That's not a contradiction, it's a tension. And people don't handle that kind of tension well. I know I don't. Because when a story involves power, real power, the expectation is that it's going to resolve cleanly. People assume there are layers, that there are connections that don't get exposed, that accountability stops somewhere short of where it should. Now, is that always fair? No. Sometimes the case is exactly what it appears to be. Sometimes the evidence only supports charges against specific individuals. Sometimes there isn't a broader conspiracy that can be proven in court. But here's the problem. This case doesn't feel like one of those. It doesn't feel small. It doesn't feel contained. It doesn't feel like something that begins and ends with two people. It's much bigger than that. And when something feels bigger than the explanation you're given, people start to fill in the blanks, not because they have proof, but because the alternative, the idea that this was the full story, just does not sit right. Think about how many times you've heard someone say some version of this. There's no way that that's all there is. That sentence right there is the engine behind everything that comes next. Because once people believe that there's more to the story than what they've been told, every new development gets filtered through that lens. Every decision looks suspect. Every coincidence feels loaded. Every unanswered question becomes evidence of something hidden. And that's how you go from a conviction happened to something about this still doesn't make sense. That's the shift. That's the moment where a case stops being just a legal matter and starts becoming something else, something cultural, something political, something that people project meaning onto. And now, remember the question that we started with. Why is this even being said out loud? Why are lawmakers talking about a pardon for someone in this case? The only person actually convicted. You can't answer that question if you don't understand this part first, because without the gap, without the missing pieces, without that lingering sense that the story never fully came into focus, the idea of a pardon would sound ridiculous. It would be dismissed immediately. But that's not what's happening. Instead, the idea lands in a space that's already full of doubt, and in that space, it doesn't sound impossible. It starts to sound plausible, at least to some people. And that's where things start to get uncomfortable. Up to this point, I've been talking about a case, a conviction, a gap in the story, but now I want to step back and look at the machine that all of this sits inside of. Because none of what we're talking about makes any sense unless you understand one very simple, very powerful reality. The President of the United States has the authority to erase a federal conviction. Just like that. No vote, no approval from Congress, no requirement to even explain the decision in any meaningful way. It's written right into the Constitution. The pardon power, broad, sweeping, almost entirely discretionary, and it applies to federal crimes, which is exactly what we're dealing with here. So when people hear the word pardon, it sounds dramatic. It sounds like something extraordinary. But structurally, it's actually very simple. One person makes a decision. That's it. The power to erase a sentence doesn't come with a requirement to explain why. Now, historically, presidents have used that power in all kinds of ways. Sometimes it's mercy. someone who served most of their time, someone who's clearly changed, cases where the punishment felt excessive in hindsight. Sometimes it's political, controversial, questioned. Sometimes it's both. And this is where Donald Trump enters the picture in a way that matters for this conversation. Because whether you support him or not, whether you agree with his policies or not, there is one thing that's just objectively true. His use of pardon power has been different, more aggressive, more personal, more willing to wade into controversial territory. And now, I don't believe that that's me editorializing. That's based on how his clemency decisions have been received and reported across the political spectrum. You had high-profile pardons for people like Paul Manafort, who was convicted of financial crimes tied to the Russia investigation. You had clemency for Roger Stone, convicted of lying to Congress and witness tampering. You had the pardon of Michael Flynn, who had pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Now, whatever your view is on those cases individually, the pattern they created in the public mind is what matters for this conversation, because those decisions weren't seen as acts of mercy. They were seen by many, including me, as acts of loyalty, acts that benefited people connected to the president, people inside his orbit, people who, in one way or another, were part of his political world. And that perception, whether you think it's fair or not, matters. Because once that perception exists, it changes how people interpret future uses of that power. It creates a lens. So now when a new situation comes up, especially one involving someone connected to, even indirectly, to powerful networks, people don't look at it in isolation. They connect it to what they've already seen. They ask, is this another one of those? Is this going to follow the same pattern? Now add one more layer to that. Trump's public persona, politically, has been heavily tied to themes like law and order, cracking down on crime, being tough on wrongdoing, not letting people get away with things. So when you combine a strong law and order message with a track record of controversial pardons and a willingness to use that power in ways that benefit people within a certain orbit, you end up with tension, because those things don't always sit comfortably together. And that tension becomes part of the story. Now bring that back to the question that we're asking. Why is the idea of a pardon for Ghislaine Maxwell even being said out loud? If the pardon power were rarely used, cautiously applied, almost sacred in how it's carefully handled, this idea would feel absurd. It would get laughed out of the room. But that's not the environment that we're in. We're in an environment where the power is broad, the precedent is controversial, and the public already believes that connections matter a lot. So when someone floats the idea, it doesn't land in a vacuum. It lands in a system where people already think they understand how the rules get bent. And suddenly, the unthinkable doesn't sound so unthinkable anymore. It sounds like something that could happen. And once something feels like it could happen, people start asking a different question. The question's no longer, is this real, but why would someone want this to happen? And that's where I want to go next. This is where things start to feel off. Not proven wrong, not illegal on its face, just off. Because up to now, everything we've talked about lives in the realm of structure and perception. The system, the gaps, the way people interpret power. But here, we get an actual sequence of events. And timing in a story like this is everything. Ghislaine Maxwell is serving a 20-year sentence. That part hasn't changed. That part is still grounded, still real. But recently, she was moved to a lower security federal facility, FCI Tallahassee. Now, on paper, that's not automatically suspicious. The Federal Bureau of Prisons moves inmates all the time. Classification changes, safety concerns, administrative decisions. That's part of how the system works. So if that were the only thing, this wouldn't be a story. But it's not the only thing. Because around that same period, there are reports that Maxwell had contact with a senior official inside the U.S. Department of Justice. Now, let's be very clear. No one has proven that those contacts caused anything. No one has established that the transfer was the result of those interactions. There is no confirmed explanation tying the two things together. But they happened in very close proximity to each other, and that is enough to trigger questions. And I'm not talking about from podcasters like me. I'm talking about from members of Congress. Specifically, Democrats on the House Judiciary Committee have formally demanded answers. They want documentation. They want timelines. They want to understand, why did this meeting happen? What was discussed? And why, shortly afterward, did Maxwell end up in a lower security facility? They're not casual questions. They're the kind of questions you ask when something doesn't line up clearly, when something doesn't pass the smell test. Now, again, and this matters, no one has proven these things are connected, but they are now officially being questioned. And once something crosses that threshold, once it moves from internet chatter to formal congressional inquiry, it changes the conversation. Now it's no longer just suspicion, it's scrutiny. And scrutiny, even when it doesn't uncover wrongdoing, has a way of shaping perception. Think about how this looks from the outside. You have a connected accomplice in one of the most high-profile criminal cases in decades. You have a system that already feels, to many, uneven when it comes to powerful individuals. You have a president with a history of using pardon power in controversial ways, and now you have reported contact with high-level officials within his administration, followed by a change in prison conditions that I think most people agree benefit the inmate in this case, followed by elected officials asking whether something unusual happened. It's not proof of anything, but it is a pattern of events that people notice. And once people notice it, they start connecting the dots. Even if those dots don't have obvious connections, that's human nature. We look for meaning. We look for cause and effect. We assume that proximity implies relationship, and often it does. But in a case like this, where the background is already filled with so many unanswered questions, people don't default to giving the benefit of the doubt. They default to suspicion. Now remember the through line here. Walk with me through this. Why is this even being said out loud? This is part of the answer. Because when you have a sequence of events that feels unusual, even if it's technically explainable, it creates an opening for interpretation, for doubt, an opening for the idea that something else might be happening beneath the surface. And once that opening exists, other ideas move in. Ideas that maybe under normal circumstances would feel completely out of bounds. Like, I don't know, say, talking about a pardon. And now we get to the moment where that idea stops being hypothetical and starts being voiced. Up to this point, everything I've been talking about has been atmosphere. A conviction, a gap, a system that allows discretion, a sequence of events that people are now questioning. All of that creates the conditions for suspicion. But conditions alone don't make a story move. You need a spark. And here it is. The idea of pardoning Ghislaine Maxwell isn't just something people are whispering about online. It's been acknowledged out loud by people inside the government. Specifically, James Comer, who chairs the House Oversight Committee, has said that some Republican members of Congress support the idea of a pardon. Now, let's slow that down. Some, not all, not even necessarily most. There's no bill, there's no coordinated push, there's no official policy position. This isn't something moving through Congress. But it's not nothing either. Because ideas don't have to be formal to matter. They just have to be acceptable enough to say out loud. And that is the shift. Because think about where this idea would have landed a few years ago, maybe even 1 year ago. A convicted accomplice in a sex trafficking case involving minors tied to one of the most infamous figures in modern criminal history, and someone says, maybe we should pardon her. That doesn't spark debate. That would get shut down immediately, you would think. It gets laughed at or condemned or both. But that's not what's happening now. Now, the idea simply gets acknowledged, discussed, explained, and in some cases, let's face it, defended. It's not policy, it's not a bill, but it's not a whisper either. Once an idea reaches that level, once it's no longer automatically taboo, it changes the entire conversation. Because now people aren't just reacting to something that could theoretically happen or might happen. They're reacting to the fact that someone somewhere thinks it should happen. And that forces a new question into the room. Why? Why would anyone look at this case, this conviction, this set of facts, and come to the conclusion that a pardon is even worth considering? Is it about fairness? Is it about due process concerns? Is it about the belief that she didn't receive a fair trial? Or is it something else? Now, to be clear, there are people who frame it in those first terms. There always are. They argue about legal technicalities, about jury issues and the scope of the case. Those arguments exist. They're part of the conversation. But even if you take those arguments at face value, they don't fully explain why this case, this defendant, is getting this kind of attention. Because there are plenty of controversial convictions, plenty of appeals, plenty of cases where people argue that justice wasn't perfectly served. They don't all generate talk of a presidential pardon. So again, we're back to the underlying question. Why this one? And this is where everything we've been talking about up to this point starts to converge. The gap, the unresolved questions, the perception of a broader network, the belief that there's more to the story than what's been proven in court. The idea that Maxwell might know things about people, about connections, about events that were never fully explored in public. You don't have to believe any of that is actionable. You don't have to believe there's a hidden list or a secret ledger or some dramatic reveal waiting in the wings, but you do have to acknowledge that a lot of people think there's more. And when people think someone holds information, that person's value changes. Not legally, not in the eyes of the court, but in the way they're perceived politically, strategically, symbolically. And that's where the idea of a pardon starts to take on a different shape, because now it's not just about mercy, it's not about justice. It becomes entangled with something else entirely, something harder to define, something people feel even if they can't prove it. And that feeling is what I want to unpack next, because this is the point where the conversation stops being about events and starts being about what those events look like they might mean. So let me say this slowly. No leaps, no accusations, just pieces on the table. You have a convicted accomplice tied to one of the most powerful and disturbing criminal operations in recent memory, Ghislaine Maxwell. You have the central figure in that operation, Epstein, dead before a full public trial could unfold. You have a case that, while it resulted in a conviction, left most people feeling like they only saw a fraction of the full picture. You have a justice system that, fairly or unfairly, a lot of people already believe treats powerful individuals differently. You have a president, Donald Trump, with a track record of using pardon power in ways, well, let's just say in ways that critics say favor people within his orbit. You have recent events that include the contact between Maxwell and the DOJ official, a subsequent move to a lower security facility, and now lawmakers openly acknowledging that a pardon is being discussed. And then there's one more piece. One that on its own doesn't prove anything, but in this context carries weight. The person who holds the pardon power is someone who had a documented social relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. Photos exist, public comments exist, emails exist. They moved in some of the same circles. There is no criminal charge tying Trump to Epstein's crimes at this point. No court findings that place him inside the conduct that led to Maxwell's conviction. That line matters. I'm not crossing it today, but we're also not ignoring something that people can plainly see. Because when people hear Epstein, they don't just think about one person. They think about a world, a network, access, influence, proximity to power. So when the person sitting at the center of that pardon power is someone who was inside that broader social orbit, it changes how everything else is received. Not legally, but perceptually. How could it not? Now stop. Just look at that list. Not as proof of anything, not as conclusion, just as ingredients. Because here's the thing about human nature. We don't like incomplete stories. We don't like gaps. We don't like situations where we feel like we're only seeing part of the picture. So what do? We fill it in. Sometimes with logic, sometimes with speculation, sometimes with assumptions that feel reasonable, even if they're not provable. And when you put all of this together, people don't need evidence of a deal to start believing there might be one. That's another shift. That's the moment where the conversation changes, because now we're no longer talking about whether something has been demonstrated. We're talking about whether something feels consistent with everything people think they already know. That's a much lower bar. Think about how often you hear phrases like, well, it wouldn't surprise me. No, that's not evidence or proof. That's alignment. It's someone taking a set of facts, a set of perceptions, a set of past experiences, and deciding that a new idea fits that pattern. And once something fits into a pattern, it starts to feel real, even if it hasn't been established as real. Now, does that mean there's no deal? No. There is no verified evidence of a quid pro quo, no confirmed arrangement, no documentation that shows any kind of exchange. And that does matter, because crossing that line, stating something like that as fact, would require proof that simply does not exist in the public record. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. You don't need proof for suspicion to take hold. You just need conditions that make suspicion feel reasonable. And this case has those conditions. There has been clamoring for more transparency where the Epstein files are concerned. You have a president who not only has a well-established connection to Epstein, but also has a history of statements and actions that, to put it mildly, don't make it hard to fathom his possible involvement in something dark. And he is the one who ultimately decides if there's a pardon. This story has secrecy, it has power, it has missing pieces, it has a system that allows for extraordinary discretion. It has a history of controversial uses of that discretion. It has a proximity to power and the world surrounding the original crimes. And now it has political voices introducing the possibility of an outcome that under normal circumstances would feel completely ridiculous. So when they hear pardon in this context, people don't hear it as a standalone idea. They hear it as part of a larger story. A story that, in many minds, already includes hidden connections, unspoken leverage, and outcomes that benefit people who aren't fully visible. Again, it's not proof. That's perception, but perception has weight. It shapes how people interpret events. It shapes what they expect to happen next. And maybe most importantly, it shapes how much trust they have in whatever does happen. Because if people already believe the system is bent in certain ways, then any action that looks like it could fit that pattern is going to be viewed through that lens. And once that lens is in place, it's very hard to take off. Which brings us to the bigger issue here. Because at a certain point, this stops being just about Maxwell and starts being about something much larger. At a certain point, it stops being about what she did, what she knew, what she might know, who she was connected to, and becomes something bigger. It becomes about trust, not abstract philosophical trust, not the kind you debate in a college classroom. I mean the very practical, everyday version of it. Do people believe that the current system works the same way for everyone? That's the question sitting underneath all of this. Because think about what we've walked through. A case that felt incomplete, a central figure who died before full public accounting, a conviction that answered some questions but left many others hanging in the air, a justice system that already carries a reputation, fair or not, of being uneven when it comes to power and influence, a president with a history of controversial uses of pardon power who has some direct involvement with the main people in this case. Recent events that raise eyebrows, and now political voices introducing the idea of clemency into that mix. None of those things on their own prove anything, but taken together, they create a feeling, and that feeling is this. Maybe the rules aren't applied evenly. Now, that's not a new concern. People have been questioning fairness in the justice system for a long time, on all sides, in all kinds of cases. But what makes this one different is who it involves. Because this case sits right at the intersection of wealth, influence, politics, and criminal accountability. It's about more than just a crime. It's about who is connected to it. And when people believe that connections matter more than facts, more than outcomes, more than consequences, trust begins to erode. Not all at once. That's not how things erode. Not in some dramatic collapse, but slowly, quietly, piece by piece. It happens when people see outcomes that feel inconsistent. It happens when explanations feel incomplete or just plain fabricated. It happens when decisions, even if they're technically justified, don't feel convincing. And eventually you reach a point where the question shifts. It's no longer, was this decision legal? It becomes, does this decision feel fair? And those are not the same thing. Something can be completely legal and still feel wrong. Completely within the rules and still feel like those rules were bent, at least in spirit. Now apply that to this situation. Imagine for a second that a pardon actually happens. Legally, it's fine. Constitutionally, it's clean. There's no requirement for any explanation. But what would the public reaction be to it? Would people accept it? Or would they immediately start asking, who's benefiting? What's behind it? Why are we pardoning this person? Why now? Because once trust is weakened, people don't take actions at face value anymore. They interpret them and analyze them and question them. And in a case like this, where the background is already filled with such fog and uncertainty, those questions don't just stay questions. They turn into conclusions. Sometimes fair, sometimes not, but conclusions nonetheless. And that's the real issue here. Because the justice system doesn't just depend on outcomes. It depends on legitimacy. It depends on people believing that the outcomes make sense, that they're consistent, that they're not influenced by things that shouldn't matter. And when that belief starts to slip, everything else gets harder. Every decision becomes suspect. Every action gets second-guessed. Every explanation feels incomplete. And suddenly you're not just dealing with a controversial case. You're dealing with a credibility problem. And let's face it, this administration has plenty of credibility problems. But not just for one decision. This credibility problem would be for the system itself, which brings us to the final piece of this. Because if a pardon were to happen, the question wouldn't just be, can it happen? It would be, what would it mean? And maybe more importantly, what would people believe it means, whether it's true or not? Let's just imagine for a second. No predictions, no claims, just play it out. A headline breaks. Presidential pardon has been granted for Ghislaine Maxwell. Again, legally clean, constitutionally clean. No broken rules, no procedural hurdle that can stop it. But the moment that headline hits, the legal part is almost irrelevant. Because the reaction isn't going to be legal analysis, it's going to be interpretation. People are going to try and understand why this happened, what it means. And they're going to do that using everything we've already talked about. Now think about the possible interpretations that start to flood in. There will be some who frame it as mercy, although I don't know any of them, and I'm sort of glad I don't. They'll argue that Maxwell didn't receive a fair trial, that the case was limited, that she became a stand-in for something larger, that she's being punished more for what people think she knows than for what was actually proven. That argument will exist. Others will see it very differently, however. They'll see protection. They'll see a powerful system closing ranks. They'll see a decision that benefits not just one person, but potentially others who would prefer that certain questions remain unanswered. And again, those are interpretations, but here's the part that matters. In a case like this, those interpretations don't carry equal weight in the public mind because of everything that came before. The lack of closure, the lingering sense that the full story was never told, the way the files themselves have been released in such a suspect manner, because of the way power has been perceived to operate in similar situations. That second interpretation, the one about protection, is going to feel a lot more believable to most people. Even if it's not proven, even if it's not true, even if the actual reason for a pardon, hypothetically, were something entirely different, that's the trap. Because once public trust is weakened, actions don't get judged by their stated reasons. They get judged on what people think is really going on. And in that environment, even a legally valid decision can land as something very illegitimate. Now, step back for a second, because, as I said, this isn't just about Maxwell. This is about what happens when a system reaches a point where people no longer separate what's proven from what feels plausible. When those two things start to blur, everything gets harder. Facts get questioned, motives get assumed, outcomes get reinterpreted through suspicion. And again, you don't have to believe that a pardon would be tied to anything improper to see the problem. The problem is that a large number of people would assume it is. And I can't say they're wrong, but that would happen immediately. And once that assumption takes hold, there's no clean way to undo it. No press conference fixes it, no statement clarifies it, no explanation satisfies it. Because the issue isn't the explanation, it's the lack of trust in the system delivering it. What could we trust about the system and this administration moving forward if this pardon happens and we're told that we have to deal with it. So now we circle back, not to a legal question, not to a political question, but to a perception question. Even if it were legal, would it feel legitimate? And if the answer to that is no, then the consequences of that decision don't stop with one case. They ripple outward into every future decision, every future controversy, every future moment where the public is asked to believe that the system is working the way it's supposed to. Because once people stop believing that, you don't just have disagreement. You have doubt bordering on chaos. Very hard to shake. So again, there's no evidence of a deal, but when a system leaves this many questions unanswered, people start filling in the blanks themselves. And that might be the most dangerous part of all. Because once people start writing their own endings to a story, maybe it's because they don't get facts, maybe it's because we've gotten to a point where facts or statements just can't be believed anymore. But once people start writing their own endings to a story, they don't wait for facts anymore. They don't wait for proof. They don't wait for confirmation. They decide what makes sense to them, and they move forward with that. And in a case like this, where power and secrecy and uncertainty are all intersecting, those conclusions can take on a life of their own, whether or not they're proven, just because they feel possible. And when enough people believe something is possible, it starts to feel real. In the end, justice doesn't just have to be done. It needs to make sense. And right now, for a lot of people, this doesn't. And that's why this is being said out loud. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to download and listen to this episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. I want to hear from you on this. What do you think about the possibility of a pardon for this woman? What do you think about the motives behind it? What do you think about the system itself, where it intersects with power and influence? Go to the podcast website, www.neighborontheleft.com. Go to the contacts page and either use the social media links or the email address and get a message to me. Let me know where you're at on this. Let me know what you're thinking. Aside from that, questions, comments, compliments, insults, whatever, I'm open to all of it. I want to hear what you think about this topic and the podcast itself. While you're on the website, you can also go to the episodes page. There's a streaming function there where you can stream or download any episode of the podcast going all the way back to the beginning. And there, of course, is the blog feature where I post to the blog posts that mirror the things I talk about on the podcast, and I include the places where I get my information. All the sources are listed for each post. I will be back on Wednesday with another episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. So between now and then, stay engaged, stay kind, and have the kind of week you'd wish for others.